last night. A boy who's the same age is being questioned on suspicion of murder. And trading of shares in Twitter have been halted after reports Elon Musk's offering to go ahead with his £38 billion deal to buy the platform. The value of the stock leapt 13% on the news. In the city, the FTSE 100 closed up 178 points at 70.86. The pound buys $1.14 and €1.15. LBC weather, rain over central parts pushing northwards tonight with a low of 9. Rain moving eastwards tomorrow, followed by blustery showers elsewhere. A high of 17 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening and welcome to Tuesday's edition of Cross Question. With me in Birmingham are Daniel Kaczynski, Conservative MP for Shrewsbury and Atcham, Salma Shah, political commentator, former special advisor to Sajid Javid when he was Home Secretary, and an old friend of mine who I haven't seen for donkey's years, Dr. Niall Gardner, Director of the Margaret Thatcher Centre for Freedom at the Heritage Foundation think tank in Washington, D.C., and a former aide to the former Prime Minister. They're here to take your calls if you've got a question for them on what's going on at the Conservative Party conference. I mean, let's face it, we could be here all week talking about that, or indeed anything else. The number to call, 0345 6060 973. You can text your question to 84850, and don't forget to watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Right, we will carry on in a moment, but I'm just going to address a subject which I addressed last week when we were at the Labour Party conference. People said, it's disgraceful, you haven't got a balanced panel, you've just got Labour people on. And today, as sure as night follows day, we have all the guests tonight, they're all Tories, no balance at all. Well, that is the thing, you have Labour at Labour, Tories at Tories, because how would we smuggle a Labour MP in here to this conference, frankly? So I make no apology for having Conservatives on the panel tonight, or indeed Labour people last week. Niall Gardner, before we go to the first question, just explain to us, we can all understand what the Margaret Thatcher Centre for Freedom is all about, but what's the Heritage Foundation?
Well, Iain, thanks very much for having me on the show. It's great to see you again after so many years. And the Heritage Foundation is the largest conservative think tank in the United States. It is dedicated to advancing the principles of liberty and freedom. It is a think tank that also focuses very heavily upon foreign policy issues, including the US-UK special relationship. And the Margaret Thatcher Centre, of course, is very much focused and dedicated upon advancing the Anglo-American alliance between our two great nations. And the Heritage Foundation is the largest publicly supported conservative organisation in the United States, in the sense that it has over 500,000 members who are supporters of the organisation. And it is a leading force for conservatism and for the principles of liberty and freedom, of course, that Margaret Thatcher held dearly in her heart.
I'm delighted you haven't developed an American accent since last time I saw you.
I certainly have not.
Right, let's go to our first question. It's from Hannah in Yeovil. Hannah, hello, what would you like to ask?
Hello, Iain. I would like to say that the Conservative Party was elected in 2019 on particularly to do with levelling up and protecting public services. Bearing that in mind, and bearing in mind that Ms Truss has completely changed that, which public services that they were committed to a year ago will be cut to fund the new staggering level of public debt?
Daniel Kaczynski.
Well, what I would say is that when the Conservative Party came into office in 2010, we were borrowing £170 billion a year after the financial crisis. Every single year from 2010 to 2019, we reduced the annual deficit, and we got it down to £19 billion in 2019, which for an economy of our size is running a balanced budget. The Labour Party called it austerity. They castigated us in the most vitriolic way for reducing the deficit. And then, of course, the pandemic came, and now we have the energy crisis. So this is the moment, having done the difficult spade work for the first 9 years of our administration, now is the time when our constituents are really, really demanding action over their energy bills. that we go to the markets and push back and borrow adequate levels of funding to sort out the energy crisis, but also to kickstart the economy. And that's why I'm so disappointed about the U-turn during the course of this conference. I value the top 1%. I applaud the men and women who have the capability to hire thousands of people to set up businesses and to create the wealth that we politicians need to distribute to public services. I know many British people, many talented British people, who have left this country to live and move their operations to Singapore, Switzerland, the United Arab Emirates, and many other jurisdictions. And I was so encouraged that this is the first Conservative Chancellor in my 17 years as a Member of Parliament who had the guts and courage to say, actually, you know what, in this globally competitive world, when there is little loyalty to individual jurisdictions, we've got a Chancellor in the post-Brexit context who is going to create the right regulatory and taxation framework to encourage these
without going
back
into
to
all
the
of
United
the
Kingdom.
whys and wherefores here. What was it just political expediency that drove this decision to U-turn, do you think?
Well, I think there were a lot of Conservative MPs, some of whom I've spoken to during this party conference, who were...
You actually found some that are here. Well done.
I've come across some Conservative MPs who have made it abundantly clear that they were going to challenge this move, which I think is wrong. I think it's destabilizing. I think not to show that loyalty to the new Chancellor and the Prime Minister is undermining our chances of winning at the next general election. Let me just say this, and you will know this, Iain. The United Kingdom has run a bankrupt model for the last 30 years. The only Prime Minister who managed to repay our debts was Margaret Thatcher. No Prime Minister since Margaret Thatcher has been able to, never mind repay our debts, but has not been able to run a balanced budget. And you will know, Iain, that the United Kingdom is now in debt to the tune of £2.1 trillion. You will know that we are spending £80 billion plus on debt interest payments, twice as much as we spend on our armed forces. And this is the first Chancellor who said, you know what? If we're going to grow the economy, we need to attract those raw talent.
But returning to Hannah's question, which you haven't really addressed, that cutting the 45p rate to 40p would have cost around £2 billion. What would you have cut to pay for that £2 billion?
It's not a question of cutting it. The £2 billion was £2 billion out of £45 billion of tax cuts. And of course, that was just 1/3 of the support for energy, support for families and businesses. It's £2 billion out of the total.
It's £2 billion that the government wouldn't have to spend on something else, on some other public service.
Well, it's £2 billion in sending a signal. We were going to invest £2 billion in sending a signal to the world that in the post-Brexit context, we are not going to penalise the wealth creators, and we're going to take advantage of our newfound freedoms to create the regulatory and taxation framework which is going to outperform the Eurozone. We've never had these opportunities.
No, but it's £2 billion that would go to fairly rich people at the expense of very poor people.
No, because there were tax cuts for many people across the board, and you will know that the top 1% pay 30% of all taxation collected. Can you imagine what would happen to your tax bill and my tax bill if the top 1% weren't there?
We don't have to imagine it because they are.
Well, you say they are. But these people flow around the world in increasing volatility, and they will move their factories, they will move their operations around the world.
If they are so fickle that a 5% tax rate will take them away from this country, maybe this country's better off without them.
No, because it's a tax rate at the moment. It's a signal. It's a signal that do we want to be a low taxation, low regulation jurisdiction, which is going to outperform the Eurozone. I think we had a chance to do that. I think we had a chance to send a signal to the world, and I'm very disappointed with the Prime Minister and the Chancellor of the Exchequer that in the face of certain recalcitrant voices from the Parliamentary Party, they've backed down on that critical step.
I mean, let's be honest. You've been a recalcitrant voice from time to time, haven't you? I mean, people just express their views. Salma Shah.
So
Let's go back to
the
the question.
question.
Which public services does the government intend to cut?
I think this becomes a very difficult question because from a practical level, they have signalled that there are going to be amazing spending cuts as a consequence of lower taxation and borrowing for taxation. And there has been some suggestion that the Chancellor may look at capital budgets, which is the stuff that sort of is about building stuff as opposed to just spending on benefits and pensions and things like that. And if that's the case, then it's a very inefficient way of running government expenditure, because that is fundamentally what the government can do in order to gain some kind of return and actually put something back that is long-lasting in public services, that kind of infrastructure spending that we're going to see. I think the point of the question ultimately is it started off about, where the manifesto was in 2019. And I think if you are going to decide to have such a huge fiscal moment where you're taking away 45p alongside other tax policy that was unfunded because the headroom that Liz Truss had originally funded her tax-cutting pledges with evaporated with inflation. So to borrow to have tax cuts that is not part of a manifesto, I think puts her actually politically in a precarious position as well.
But in the end, the biggest budget in Whitehall is the Department of Work and Pensions. And you can't really have meaningful cuts unless you cut benefits. And that's what the debate has been about at the conference today between cabinet ministers as to whether benefits should be cut or other things should be cut instead.
Well, and there's another political question here, is that, the last Prime Minister said that actually benefits should be uprated because of the pain that people are going to feel in terms of inflation. And so not only to sort of row back on that, actually to cut, I think is a very difficult thing for this Prime Minister to do.
Niall Gardner, it's tempting to ask what would Margaret Thatcher do in this situation, because she was known for wanting a smaller state, tax cuts, lower public expenditure, but she was a lot more pragmatic than people often credit her with, wasn't she? Particularly in the early years.
Well, that's a good point, and I think the situation that Margaret Thatcher inherited when she became Prime Minister at the end of the 1970s was significantly graver than the situation to now, even though the situation at the moment with the energy crisis and so on is serious. But if you look at the damage inflicted by the socialist government on the British economy, the sick man of Europe, basically in the 1970s, it was absolutely immense. And the UK had to go, with a begging bowl to the IMF for a loan in the late 1970s.
Don't tempt fate.
So, the situation Margaret Thatcher faced was absolutely on a grand scale, and she took several years, of course, to really put Britain back on track, and she of course was in favour of low taxes, deregulation. She advanced a pro-growth agenda. It took several years, of course, to be implemented and to successfully turn the United Kingdom around. And she did take her time, acknowledging, of course, the vast challenges that were in place. I think with Liz Truss, there's so much pressure on her to act immediately. She has a maximum of just over 2 years to the next general election, potentially. And so she is under pressure to really act very, very swiftly, decisively. And I think that it's a somewhat different sort of scenario to that of Margaret Thatcher. But I would say this, that with regard to Liz Truss and her government, when they put forward new economic plans, they have to be, I think, carefully thought out. They have to be presented to the public in a clearly explained fashion. I think the overall approach that she has taken is the right one. But I think a far greater effort should have been made in terms of explaining exactly what the government was going to do, how it's going to be funded. I do agree with Daniel that the U-turn really has fundamentally undermined the government. It undermines trust in the government. It presents an image of weakness rather than strength. And I'm in no doubt that if Margaret Thatcher were with us today, she would have strongly advised the Prime Minister, Liz Truss, against performing U-turn. Once you put this policy in place, it is very dangerous to start backtracking, because the Prime Minister's enemies will scent, blood in the water, both in terms of the Labour Party, but also the left wing of the Conservative Party as well. They will see a weakened, injured Prime Minister, and I think there are dangerous long-term consequences of that, actually.
And if you do a U-turn, you've got to be sure that you're actually going to get some political credit for doing it. And I don't see Liz Truss having got any political credit for doing this whatsoever.
Well, hold on. I don't think it's a question of getting political credit for it. I think it was stemming inevitable demise, because actually she went in to number 10 only having a third of the parliamentary party having backed her originally.
Wrong. She only got 50 MPs in the first round.
You're right.
That's her core vote.
Yes, you're right. In fact, it was much lower. You're absolutely right. And so, the way that it ended up in terms of her, Rishi and Penny, who were in the final three, it was a third. So that's what I'm basing my judgment on. So already she goes in with a lot of the parliamentary party sceptical about her abilities. So it's not just a question of sort of communicating the plans to the public. It really is about building that consensus within cabinet as well, for the relevant people who need to know, because it's a tax measure, so not everybody does need to know. But building that consensus and being able to sell it to her colleagues who are already sceptical, who already have been sort of rubbished by her in many ways, because they haven't, all that experience and talent that exists in the Conservative Party hasn't been brought into government. So she started off from a weak position, and then she U-turned, because it wasn't just the party or the public. The markets didn't like this at all. So it's not just that judgment.
Well, I'm sure we're getting some more questions on this kind of theme over the course of the hour. So let's if you'd like to give us a call, 0345 6060 973. We have our panel with us until 9 o'clock. It's 18 minutes past 8.
LB
and from destinations.
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
20 past 8 on LBC. I was just gossiping with my panel here, and my producer wrote on the screen, "Coming back now!" 3 question marks. So we're back. Daniel Kaczynski is with us, Conservative MP for Shrewsbury and Atcham, Salma Shah, political commentator, and Dr. Niall Gardner from the Margaret Thatcher Centre for Freedom. Right, let's go to our next caller. It is David in Cheltenham. Hello, David.
Hello there.
Hi, what would you like to ask?
Okay, well, can I just prefix what I'm going to be saying by saying I would have been one of those people who would have benefited by the cut in income tax. And my question is, does the Conservative Party still exist? Because it's become so ideologically driven, probably by Brexit, or anybody with a sort of moderate view has been whinnied out of the party, and we seem to have been left with just a set of ultra-right-wing ideologues who are not representative of the Conservative Party as I remember them.
Do you not think this sort of thing was said in the 1980s? It was certainly said under Ian Duncan Smith in the early 2000s, possibly not so much under David Cameron and Theresa May. But anyway, let's see what the panel thinks. Niall.
Interesting question there from David in Cheltenham. I would say actually the Conservative Party remains quite a broad church, and we're seeing that this week, frankly. And if indeed the party was in the grip of the ultra-right, then I don't think that Liz Truss would be doing a U-turn this week. I mean, clearly you have a lot of MPs who are, I would say, quite centrist. Some of them are even left-wing, actually, in terms of their outlook. I mean, the wets of the Conservative Party are alive and well, as we're seeing right now. And I would say that what you are seeing is an all-out attack on the Prime Minister from the more sort of, as Margaret Thatcher would call them, the wet wing of the Conservative Party. We're seeing that at the moment. And so I don't agree with the idea that, the party has overwhelmingly, turned rightwards ideologically. If anything, I think that what we are seeing this week is a strong showing for the more sort of centrist and sort of leftist sections of the Conservative Party. That concerns me, actually. I mean, I believe that the Conservative Party should be standing for conservative principles and ideas. And you clearly have many Conservative MPs who do not share this kind of low-tax, pro-growth agenda. In fact, I was reading an op-ed piece by former Cabinet Minister in The Times this morning that read like it was a sort of manifesto from the Labour Party, frankly. And so...
name and shame.
Well, it's Grant Shapps, actually. I have to say, if that sort of piece was written by a Republican politician in the United States, there would be very, strong rejection, I think, of that kind of message among US conservatives.
Grant would describe himself as a Thatcherite. And this is where the Republican Party and the Conservative Party have diverged, because I couldn't identify with many Republicans nowadays. They seem to have drifted off into some sort of bizarre sort of Republican land which normal people don't belong to.
But I would say that if you look at US Republicans and their economic outlook, largely based upon advancing economic freedom, it's the same outlook that you see on the right of the Conservative Party today. The strong synergy between where Liz Truss is on economic issues and the bulk of the US Republican Party. But if you read a piece like Grant Shapps' article in The Times, I thought that piece was deeply out of touch, actually, with where, frankly, a great deal of the grassroots of the Conservative Party are. That's why Liz Truss was picked on she was chosen as the leader of the Conservative Party on a pro-growth economic freedom agenda. She talked about tax cuts left, right and centre as part of the campaign. So the Conservatives who voted for her knew exactly what they were getting with Truss.
But she is being accused of presiding over a sort of a libertarian sect within the Conservative Party, sort of dominated by thinkers from the IEA, the Adam Smith Institute, people like that. I'm not saying there's anything necessarily bad about that, but there is this conflict between libertarianism and conservatism, and I mean, in theory, the two are opposed, aren't they?
Well, I think that Liz Truss is advancing traditional conservative thinking. It's not necessarily a sort of libertarian worldview, as you'll see with the government's immigration policies, for example. This is not a libertarian government. It's a government, though, with an economic agenda, I think, that is all about economic liberty and freedom, which is why I'm so disappointed about the U-turn, because this should be an aspirational society, and we should encourage everyone to be able to create wealth, and ultimately that helps everyone in society, from the poorest through to those who have more advantages in society. So,
well, looking at the Twitter feed, quite a lot of Grant Shapps supporters aren't liking what you're saying, it has to be said.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
Salma.
This is entirely the point. And whilst I agree with Niall that the Conservatives have always been a broad church. Oh, look, I'm being applauded.
Well done. We're trying to find out who is holding this party, but we'll find out by the end of the hour.
It's a broad church, but conservatism has always evolved. And I think you would accept, and please, if you disagree with me, please do, that Thatcherism was an evolution from where traditional conservatism sat when Mrs. Thatcher took over in the 70s. But fundamentally, we can have a discussion about conservatism and what conservatism means, but in 2 years' time, Liz Truss, or perhaps before, is going to have to go to the country in order to ask to remain in number 10. And if the electorate is not behind you, and if you've not rolled the pitch in a way that says, come with us, where your future and this is where aspiration is, then how on earth do you expect to advance anything about conservatism from the opposition benches?
Okay, Daniel?
Well, I think the caller is wrong to label people as extreme right wing or extreme left wing. I mean, it's a marvelous way for people to denigrate somebody, isn't it? By castigating in a particular category. You are extremely right wing. Actually, from my own perspective, I'm very right wing on economic policy, but I'm very liberal on social policies. So I think each individual politician and each individual citizen has a matrix or dynamics of what they believe in terms of economy, in terms of social policy, perhaps bearing in mind their own individual circumstances or their family circumstances. So it's a way in which to denigrate people who are taking part in a democratic debate. I speak as the only Conservative Member of Parliament who was born in a communist country, where we had a one system, one party, one system, and if anybody objected to that system, they would either be imprisoned or they would be taken away and shot. I think we should celebrate the fact that we are a nation of such extraordinary, diverse and polarizing views, because that is the essential ingredient for a functioning democracy. But I go back to the earlier point about Liz Truss. Margaret Thatcher, and I'm old enough to remember, I wasn't there at the time, but I'm old enough to remember, and I've watched it on YouTube many times. I think Margaret Thatcher at the Conservative Party conference in 1981 or 1982, when all the wets and the recalcitrants were going to knife her and throw her under a bus. This isn't working. We've got to get rid of you, or we've got to get you to change your mind. That woman, more than any other politician in my lifetime, had the guts, the determination, the vision, and the courage, the strategy to say, this lady is not for turning. She understood what was essential for the United Kingdom to get us out from under the appalling economic circumstances that we faced under James Callaghan, with the trade unions, with the going to the IMF in 76, totally bankrupt. Let's not forget that this nation was bankrupt.
Well, let's not go through the whole history, but I mean, the question was about the Conservative Party. The question was, has it moved so far to the right that it's effectively UKIP light now? Now, you're saying, well, you are very right-wing on economic policies and liberal on social policies. I would say exactly the same thing about myself, but of course people have to box things in to right wing, left wing, and never the twain shall meet, and that's certainly the social media world that we live in now, isn't it?
Except with the Conservative Party, we did essentially have a purge of sort of the one nationers in the middle, over Brexit, and so there was a vast wave of the parliamentary
purged themselves.
Well, yes, but I think withdrawing the whip during the voting for Brexit obviously meant that a large wing of that party that's part of the Conservative tradition, however much conflict that brings in, was removed. And I think there is a sense that actually the broadness of conservatism is now a little narrower.
Okay.
Can I just say?
Very quick.
Can I just say, this year, in December, we are joining the world's largest trading organization, the CPTPP. $9.5 trillion market. Can you imagine the only European country to join the largest and fastest growing trade bloc in the Far East? That is a huge opportunity for the United Kingdom, which Liz Truss negotiated as Secretary of State for International Development. I go out to my constituents in Shrewsbury and they say to me, what's exciting you And I say the CPTPP, nobody knows what it is because the media in this country don't want to talk about the huge opportunities ahead of this country in terms of trade. And by the way, we created wealth in this country with our ability to trade. They want to denigrate Liz Truss over the U-turn. They want to denigrate the Prime Minister over the Partygate issue. But there are some really fundamentally important things that are happening as a result of Brexit. And the fact that this country, the only European country to be invited to join the world's fastest and largest trading bloc, I find that astounding. And it's going to have a huge impact on us economically and from our commercial aspects around the world.
A texter says, 1981 and Margaret Thatcher were mentioned. The year she said that you and I shouldn't exist as gay men. She never said anything of the sort. In fact, she was one of the 6 Conservative MPs in 1967
Correct.
to disobey the whip and vote for the decriminalisation of homosexuality. So get your facts right. It's 8:32 on LBC. Lots of questions to come on Cross Question. Let's get the news headlines with Daryl Jackson.
The Home Secretary has told the Conservative members she'll introduce laws making it clear the only route into the UK is a safe and legal one. Suella Braverman claims channel crossings in small boats are becoming a chronic problem with people abusing modern slavery laws to avoid deportation. The Chancellor says he is very proud of his mini-budget, despite it causing a fall in the markets and having a major tax cut withdrawn yesterday. Kwasi Kwarteng told a Conservative conference fringe event that his first 4 weeks in the role have gone very well. And Elon Musk has confirmed within the last few minutes that he has changed his mind and says he will now go ahead with his planned purchase of Twitter. The billionaire agreed a takeover deal in April but pulled out in the summer, claiming there were too many bots operating on the platform. LBC weather: rain over central parts pushing northwards tonight, rain moving eastwards tomorrow, followed by blustery showers and a high of 17 degrees.
This is LB.
T's and C's apply.
Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
8:36. Matthew on Twitter says, if you were wondering how the modern Tory party and its conference are going, Iain Dale and co have been stuck talking about Margaret Thatcher for the last half an hour.
Exactly.
It is true, actually. That's fair criticism. Wow. Right, we have with us Daniel Kaczynski, Conservative MP for Shrewsbury and Atcham, Salma Shah, political commentator, and Niall Gardner, who's director of the Margaret Thatcher Centre for Freedom at the Heritage Foundation. That's kind of partly why we have, isn't it? Because we've got Niall here. Right, let's go to a text question from Stephen in London. If Nadine Dorries is right that the government is no longer following the policies set out in the last general election manifesto, is the House of Lords now free to vote down bills which do not reflect manifesto commitments? If so, which of the new PM's policies are most vulnerable to being voted down by peers? Well, a lot to go on there. Salma.
Well, I don't think they've. I think the Salisbury Convention's always been applicable here, where they could have voted anything down that Liz Truss puts forward. I think the thing that is probably more urgent for Downing Street is the fact that MPs will probably vote something down before it even gets to the House of Lords. But a lot of the legislation,
even with a majority of 70 odd.
Yeah. Exactly, because the working majority is less than that. So she'd need 36 people to go off. And then things start falling. Largely, though, the legislation that she has in place doesn't look like it's going to change. There's going to be some alterations, perhaps to the online safety bill, but we haven't had anything new that's being put forward, apart from, of course, the potential finance bill in which this contentious 45p was in. So I think the Lords have always been free to vote anything down by convention that was not in the manifesto, but we'll see how the other place wants to react to what's coming.
Daniel?
Well, I think their lordships understand that under our constitution they've got to be extraordinarily careful to vote against any financial measures. This is a government, admittedly, we have changed party leader or prime minister. I went to the 1922 committee and urged my colleagues not to ditch the previous Prime Minister. I think it's very, very dangerous when the parliamentary party take on the electorate and change the party leader mid-term. But they decided to do it. And we have a new Prime Minister, but at the end of the day, the mandate is still there. The mandate from 2019, when we got the largest majority since 1987, is still there. And I think if the House of Lords attempt now, in the final 2 years of this Parliament, to take on this Prime Minister over financial matters, they are skating on thin ice.
Nadine's point was, and she said this to me earlier, and it's got a lot of support on Twitter from people who never thought they'd ever agree with her, that if the parliamentary party have got rid of the leader, but it's quite another thing for the new leader to change all the policies. And obviously she hasn't changed them all, but quite a lot of the main policies she has changed, and so the manifesto mandate from 2019 is not there anymore.
Not true, because you and I will remember November of 1990 when Margaret Thatcher was deposed and John Major came in. There was radical change in the early part of 1991. The biggest, the most evocative of which was the poll tax. But there were many, many radical changes away from the Margaret Thatcher manifesto of 1987. And yet John Major did not call an election until April of 1992. He went on for another year and a half. Then we had an election, and then he got back in, I think, with the majority of 25 or 24. So, at the end of the day, Liz Truss has, under our constitution, the mandate to change policies. She is the Prime Minister, as long as she can have the confidence of the cabinet. We live in a cabinet government. As long as the cabinet backs her, she should be able to implement these policies.
But there is one big difference to John Major, though, in that John Major was never 30 points behind in the polls.
Well,
he was towards 1997, but not in the early 2 years.
No, he didn't. And of course, but as you and I know, that you cannot run a government and you cannot run a country based on the oscillating nature of opinion polls. In this country, we live and rule the system based on the mandate at general elections. And there are millions of people in this country, by the way. What was her name? Brenda? Was it Brenda?
Brenda from Bristol.
Brenda. I mean,
No, another one.
Brenda, I think, epitomizes a lot of people across the United Kingdom, whereby there is reticence about a disproportionate number of general elections. They expect to vote once every 4 years, whatever changes
believe me, there's
that
quite
take
a lot
place.
of people that would like an election.
Well, there are, but I don't think at a time of economic crisis, a general election is the optimum way
Let's
forward.
go to Niall Gardner.
Yeah, I agree that the House of Lords has to be very cautious about potentially derailing any legislation from the Liz Truss government, and I think it would be a very, very risky approach for the Lords to take to do that, especially with regard to the economic agenda. Important to bear in mind, of course, the House of Lords was not particularly helpful in terms of the Brexit process. And in fact, many members of the House of Lords were determined to derail Brexit, actually, despite it being the will of the British people. And so I think they're on very, very shaky ground if they're seeking to undermine, disrupt the agenda of the Liz Truss government. So I think it would be a bad idea for the Lords to be thinking along those lines, actually. And I would hope that the Lords would play a constructive role in terms of the broader government's agenda here. It's absolutely vital, I think, that the British economy is rebooted, kick-started, and that we're back in the business of creating jobs, creating prosperity, and creating a better future for the British people, frankly.
Right, let's go to... Thank you very much for that, Stephen. Let's go to Lenny in Ashford. Lenny, what's your question, please?
Good evening, Iain. Good evening, panel. Regarding the boat migrants, would it be correct in referring to them as invaders?
Why'd you ask that question? Who's done that?
I've got two reasons for asking it, but I looked up in the dictionary, and it says an unwelcome intrusion into another's domain.
So, sorry, I thought you were saying that a politician had referred to them as invaders.
No,
Did I misinterpret that?
No, miss. I'm sorry. It might be my vocabulary. I'm very sorry, Iain. No, what I said is it correct or not correct in referring to them as an invader? Okay. And I've told you what it says in the dictionary, right. and that's what it actually says.
Daniel.
Well, what I would say is that this government has to deal with the...
No, answer the question. Is it right to use that language?
An invader? No, absolutely not. And I remonstrate with any concept of calling these people invaders. It's an anathema to most logical thinking people. They're not invaders, they are illegal immigrants. And, we have to ensure that there is a system whereby genuine asylum seekers and indeed economic migrants that want to come to the United Kingdom, and I'm a foreigner myself who escaped communism in 1978, that they are afforded the opportunity of coming legally to the United Kingdom. What concerns me, however, is the Rwanda issue. We've seemed to have put all of our...
Well, with respect, that's not the question.
Okay.
And I want to be quite brief on this because I need to go to a break imminently. Salma?
I agree with Daniel.
Well, that's very good to be so brief. Niall?
I wouldn't use the term invader or invasion. But this is a hugely serious issue, as it is with the United States. You have 2 million illegal migrants who have entered the US actually under Joe Biden. And this is a top voter concern on both sides of the Atlantic. And there should be everything done possible to prevent illegal migration into the United Kingdom and into the United States. We have to see action taken, and naturally I think the large numbers of Britons and Americans are very, very upset by the lack of action that has been taken. This is a serious matter, And I can understand why there are some who would see this as an invasion, yes.
OK, we will take more of your questions in a moment. 0345 6060 973. It's 8:46.
LBC. Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player.
Prime Minister Liz Truss. Pensions will rise in line with inflation, but not the same, it would appear, with benefits. Why are pensioners more important than those who are on benefits?
People are in a different situation depending on which stage of life they're in.
How helpful is it having folks such as Michael Gove and Grant Shapps up in Birmingham holding their fringe meetings and giving you the benefit of their views of life?
Well, I love all of my parliamentary colleagues in the Conservative Party, and I love hearing their opinions and talking to them. And what I want to do...
Do the loves reciprocate, Prime Minister?
It is.
They love you.
So they tell me.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
With Motorway, where dealers compete to give you their best price for your car.
LBC.
Conditions apply.
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
8:49. Daniel Kaczynski, Salma Shah and Niall Gardner with me answering your questions. Henry in Leicester has a text question. He says, President Biden has apologised for a gaffe at a speech last week when he called on a congresswoman despite her having died in August. All presidents make mistakes and do silly things, but how do you think he's getting on when it comes to his agenda? Niall.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm glad that was asked because this is a big issue. I think that without a doubt, Joe Biden is in a state of mental decline, and that's clear for anyone to see. And your caller referenced Joe Biden at a recent rally where he called out to a former member of Congress who had recently died, actually. And
you could have just forgotten. You can't draw a conclusion from that, can you?
Yeah, there's just so many examples like that, really. And Biden really is, I think, declining very significantly. Interestingly, the British press has focused a lot more on this than the US media, which is very deferential towards Biden. I think overall, just switching to the policy side, I think the overall agenda of the Biden administration, which is the most left-wing US presidency, I think, in American history, I think it's been absolutely disastrous. And on so many fronts. And The US economy is in free fall, heading for a recession. The stock market is in a state of collapse. You have very little confidence in a government that is spending vast amounts of taxpayers' money. The United States has a $30 trillion national debt. This is absolutely staggering. And yet the Biden administration is committed to spending trillions of dollars more. And we are seeing the bankruptcy of the world superpower. But also, with regard to Joe Biden, I think he is someone who demonstrates a fundamental lack of leadership on the world stage. And on so many fronts. This is the United States in decline under this Democrat presidency. And without a doubt, I think the midterm elections are going to be a huge wake-up call for Biden and for the Democrats. And we are looking at likely another conservative revolution on Capitol Hill that we've not seen since 1994 in the days of Newt Gingrich. So,
and if there is, how many of those people, how many of the new senators, congressmen, women, how many of those are going to be adherents of Donald Trump? Because my spies tell me that Donald Trump will announce a second run after the midterm elections.
I think that Republican voters in the United States support a very wide range of candidates. Donald Trump remains very popular, of course, within the Republican base. But if you look at the strength and depth of the Republican leadership at the moment, figures such as Ron DeSantis, for example, Nikki Haley, Mike Pompeo, Ted Cruz, Mike Pence, for example, it's a very strong bench that they have. And if you look across the aisle at the Democrats, and you've got Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, and a group of relative unknowns, frankly, there's a huge gulf, frankly, in quality between the Republican side and the Democratic side. And I have to say that Kamala Harris has also, like President Biden, been absolutely disastrous as vice president. And her recent remarks, where she talked about federal hurricane relief aid for Florida being dictated along lines of equity, which is a code word, of course, for a system of racial preferences in the United States, this was loudly condemned across the US. And that's an example. This is a very extreme administration with policies that would not be acceptable in the United Kingdom or across Europe. And you have a presidency that advances, I would say, racial divisions. And Kamala Harris's recent remarks were an absolute disgrace over hurricane relief and widely condemned. This is a presidency that is sinking rapidly, it's in free fall, and is inflicting immense damage upon the credibility of the United States at home and abroad.
Salma?
I think it's interesting what Niall said, and I do agree that the Democrats do seem to be weakened in terms of what their sort of future looks like, because there isn't a strong bench of candidates that are going to come in, which is why Joe Biden had to return to the front. I do think, obviously Joe Biden is not a young man, and it's easy enough perhaps to forget, the name of somebody, or you might not have even known that they had passed. But there is this frequency with him sort of being slightly gaffe-prone. And I think it probably, from a communications perspective, doesn't really instill a lot of confidence in the American people. And I think the Democratic campaign is going to be very, very difficult, especially if you do have a resurgent Trump.
Daniel?
What I would say is that I think that he has made some very, very serious mistakes. Not putting sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which President Trump promised to do, I think was a serious error. I had debates on the floor of the House of Commons urging our own government to put sanctions on companies involved in this project. But the biggest mistake that he's made is interfering in such a public way over the Northern Ireland Protocol. I think President Reagan, although he had Irish roots, understood the importance of the transatlantic relationship with the United Kingdom, and he tried to have a level balance between the disputes that we have between the Republic of Ireland, Northern Ireland, and the United Kingdom. This president and his vice president have said some quite extraordinary things about the United Kingdom in the sense that we have to comply, we have to compromise with the European Union. I've never come across that sort of level of interference from the United States of America in the domestic affairs of another permanent member of the UN Security Council. And I think that's a very, very damaging and wrong mistake, which is actually hurting the bilateral transatlantic relationship. And I very much hope that the American voters will recognize the way in which this president has damaged and undermined the most important relationship that exists within NATO.
Do you not think that Donald Trump did quite a lot to do that as well?
Well, Donald Trump was a very controversial president, of course, there's no doubt about it, but he did believe in the transatlantic relationship with the United Kingdom, and he fought and worked with British prime ministers to ensure that the bedrock of the NATO alliance was maintained and protected.
He did more than anyone's ever done in its history to undermine NATO.
Yes. I agree.
No,
Absolutely.
he didn't. He didn't. Can I just respond to that?
Very briefly, and then
because the concept of NATO, and we are 30 members, soon to be 32 members, the strongest 33 members, the strongest military defense pact in the world. Trump did more than any other president to start to get some of these states that do not spend 2% of GDP on defense.
That is absolutely true.
To step out to the plate and pay for it.
Yep.
Gone are the days where the United Kingdom taxpayer should and is paying a disproportionate amount of taxpayers' money for the collective defense of our continent.
Yes, I wholeheartedly agree with that. I do think that Trump applied tremendous pressure upon some of our NATO allies to spend more on defence, and we're now seeing the benefits of that tough approach being taken. And on the point of Biden and Brexit in Great Britain, Biden's attacks on the UK over the Northern Ireland Protocol, for example, have been an absolute disgrace. He is fundamentally intervening in British politics here. He is undermining the special relationship. He is surrounded by advisors who really have a great deal of animosity towards Brexit. I do think Biden's done a lot of damage, actually, to the US-UK special relationship.
Okay. Right, final question from James in Cambridge. A bloke in Hampshire has spent 16 years building a replica Spitfire, which has now actually taken to the skies. Could you ask your panel, what's their finest ever DIY or crafting achievement? Well, I'm taking it from that you haven't got any, Salma.
I tried to build myself a little cupboard once. It sort of fell apart almost as soon as I built it. So I have no DIY skills. I would like to have DIY skills, but I also don't know when I'm going to fit in building a Spitfire in my life at the moment.
Niall?
Probably building Airfix Spitfire models, actually, is probably the greatest accomplishment. But what a tremendous achievement that is. That's really
to get it to fly.
That's wonderful to hear.
Yeah. Daniel?
Well, I'm a great horticulturalist, and I love growing flowers and vegetables. And at the age of 14, I was bought my first ever greenhouse, and I assembled it myself. Wow. And I grew all the vegetables for my family as a child, and so that's my greatest achievement.
I think a Lego spaceship is probably my greatest achievement. That was only 2 years ago. Actually, that's a lie. But you knew that anyway, didn't you? Listen, thank you all very much, Niall Gardner, Salma Shah and Daniel Kaczynski. Coming up in a moment, we're going to talk about Suella Braverman, the new Home Secretary. She's made quite a controversial speech today at the conference. We're going to play you a little bit out of it. It's all about stopping people coming over to the United Kingdom over the Channel from Calais. And I wonder whether you'll agree with her solution. You're listening to LBC. It's 9 o'clock.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, the Home Secretary's vowed to make the Rwandan immigration scheme work, telling the Tory conference the number of people crossing the Channel in small boats is becoming chronic. Suella Braverman promised new laws to ensure people can only reach the UK through safe and legal routes. Enver Solomon, the chief executive of the Refugee Council, says there are options that need exploring.
We haven't seriously looked at how we can expand what are known as safe routes, so how we can provide the opportunity for Afghans who make up a large number of people making dangerous journeys across the Channel.
The Prime Minister stood by the government's U-turn on scrapping plans to abolish the top rate of income tax, saying she feels absolutely no shame. Liz Truss has also refused to confirm whether benefits will be raised in line with inflation rather than wage increases, which would give a smaller increase. There's been disagreement on both issues among Tory MPs and cabinet ministers. Former Tory leader Iain Duncan Smith told LBC his colleagues need to get a grip.